Hello everybody, I wanted to recap some key information for your VR project. Now we're 1 week in. Here's a lot of the common things that have cropped up after the first week, so let's get straight into it. Scene naming. This has been a problem for one or two of you, so let's talk what I mean. We've got our example project just set up here at the moment. I've got a few bits and pieces in here, but it's ultimately just the standard space. What I wanted to show you first and foremost is the way this project is set up. No matter what you've got in your asset space, you'll have a folder called scenes, and in there you have a scene called sample scenes. You can tell that that's the currently open scene. I've double clicked it. It hasn't taken me anywhere. I'm already in it. And you can see at the top of the top bar the name of the project, which is in my case VR template blah 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 copy, and then the current name of the open scene. This can be important if you've got duplicates. What I want to show you here and what's really important is if you download an asset which contains a folder called scenes, which contains a scene called sample scene, that will override all of your work. So let's change the name straight away. Just in case you missed that, it'll override all of your work. So let's get renaming your scene. So in your scenes folder and in your sample scene, obviously that's what's open. Let's rename it. Right click and rename. And I'm going to call that something like main game level 1, mission 1, whatever. Press enter. It may ask you to reload, it may not, depending on where you are. Now if you pull in an asset from the asset store that contains a scene called sample scene, it won't override it, it will just get placed next to it in this folder directory. So that's the first issue that have cropped up for some people that I would rather resolve before we do anything else. So that's our first thing there done, scene naming. This does point out as well if you are going to have multiple scenes for your main menus. Perhaps you've looked at main menus yet. I don't think you will have done at this stage, but if you have, you'll put them in the scenes folder as well. In the same way you're going to have a win screen and a lose screen, they're just scenes. Remember, look back to my earlier tutorials for how we did scene transitions. Next thing on our hit list, hands. I did cover this in a further tutorial earlier on, but just recapping what we can see in game at the moment. When you open up the template, you have a set of controllers in the position of your hands, and it's also worth pointing out at this moment in time I've got the device simulator switched on, so I'm looking my head around. It's deeply unpleasant, and that is because of the device simulator. So as an added bonus fact, let's just remember to go to edit and project settings. In the XR plugin management, at the XR interaction toolkit right at the bottom, turn off the device simulator if you're on headset. If you're not on headset, turn it on. So when we replay our game, that would be a test for the testing table, just so you guys would be aware. We've got our project, we've got a set of hands that are visible within this scene, and we've got our rays. So let's talk about how I did that. On the Moodle page, I've created for you under the assignment for resources section. You'll notice that you've got a bunch of resources. We're going to talk about them in quite a bit of detail later on. But the one I'm interested in here is the XR hands. Oculus Hands New, that's what I've created here. This is just a package, so you give that a download. It is a Unity package, and this is how easy it is to import, to drag it into your scene. I'm going to open up my Unity project. You don't even have to have this maximized. Literally all I want to do is drag that package into the asset space. It'll tell me I've already got it. That's why it's not giving me all of these options, but you just click OK and import, and that will add it to your project. You get this folder called Oculus Hands. Inside of there, you've got the models, the prefabs, and the materials. The prefabs are the things we care about. There's one for left hand and one for right hand. And in there, you've also got the materials folder, which just contains this simple green material. If you wanted to go and change the color of it, or perhaps you wanted that to be customizable by your player, it's easy enough to change the RGB values, or you can obviously set it to whatever value you wanted. So that's how you would change the colour of the material. If I go into prefabs, you'll now see that that is blue. It's looking at that material. The way you get that into your game though is under the XR interaction setup, in the XR origin, in the locomotion system, no, in the camera offset I should say. I always get a bit lost around here. You've got the left and the right controller. If I go into the left controller and click on it, the same for right controller in a moment, but on the left controller you'll notice that under the XR controller component, right at the very bottom of that component, after all the settings, you've got which model do we want to have loaded. Usually for you guys that will say the controllers. I've just dragged and dropped in from the prefab slot here the left or right hand as is appropriate. So in the left controller I've obviously dragged in the left hand, in the right controller I've dragged in the right hand. If you wanted a tutorial space where the controller is visible, well, just don't do that. If you do ever want to get back to your original prefab, let's say you completely mangle your character or something goes horribly wrong, just a recap as to how to fix that. So there's the interaction setup, there's everything that controls the play and whatever. If it goes wrong, literally just delete it. And in the samples folder, in the XR interaction, in 5.2. Starter assets, in the prefabs, you've got the XR interaction setup prefab. That is literally your starting asset. So if you wanted, something goes wrong, your height goes wrong, or you affect your hands and you can't think how to get back to it, that's how you do that. So that's another bonus fact. So I'm just going to pop the hands back on, show you how easy it is to do. Left controller, right controller. On the left controller, I'm going to go into Oculus Hands, prefabs. Remember, it's prefabs, not models. Left controller, I don't want to use the XR controller left, I want to use the left hand. And the right controller, I want to use the right hand. This is the model prefab, and you can see I've changed it because there's a little line next to it. You may find the hands are a little bit too big or a little bit too small or not perfect. I've struggled to get these right, which is why I didn't include them in the template to start off with. If you wanted to customize them in any way, you can double click into the prefab and edit them. So if you wanted them to be bigger or smaller, obviously you can scale them down. Just keep in mind the values. And if you find it's not in a position that you're happy with, you can change the position relative to the your physical hand position relative to where the hands will be. I could never get a value I was happy with, but if you wanted to make the hands a little bit smaller, well, that's easy as clicking your lock tool and then scaling it down, and that will keep it consistent no matter what. If you wanted giant clown hands, that's a thing you could do. Reason why I locked it is obviously you want left hand and right hand to be the same values. It wouldn't make sense for one hand to be larger than the other. So I lock it, set it to a value that I like there. Whoops, I've unlocked it. Lock it, set it to a value you like the look of, and then you could of course copy that and paste it. Just be aware, the left hand will have a -1 or a minus value on the Y. The right hand will have a positive value. That is literally because when I made this, I just scaled it on the Y-axis, and once it goes past 0, it flips the other way around. That's why there's a difference there. Remember to leave prefab mode, click left. So that should all be operational, he says confidently. So that's obviously how to get hands within your scene. The hands don't look great. Okay, if you look at the hands, you'll find that they're really blocky, really solid. Not perfect. Oh, confused there. So you can see that they're there. You've also got the tunneling vignette, which I'll show you how to turn off as well. But we've got our hands. We can do better than that though. On the Moodle page, I've got a link to a really nice shader. So literally called Very Nice VR Hand Shader is what I link to here. It's this ghostly hand shader, maybe literally I'm the top comment apparently, but it's a nice thing to add to your hands if you want to. So I'm going to give that a download and an import. And I'll show you how easy it is to apply. Just be aware, this does affect performance. So if you were to use this, you're spending a bit of your performance budget, i.e. your frame rate will drop a little bit. So I've got the left hand here. If I double click on the left hand, just so I go into prefab mode, I'm now going to go and find that new shader. Good luck finding ghostly hands. If I go into built-in renderer, because that's what we're using, they do have one for universal render pipeline. But if I go into built-in renderer shader, I am confused by this. So they've changed the way it works. Looks like I've got to double click on the ghostly hand shader and import it a second time. There we go. That's what I was looking for. And you've got a bunch of pre-created settings. You can just see there's some settings here for the shader. Perhaps I wanted that one. And now you can see that's a little bit semi-transparent and a little bit nice. Maybe I wanted that one. It's a little bit invisible, really, really impossible to see. And what's nice about this is the gradient as the hand moves up. I'm just going to do the same to the right hand. Again, notice you've got to go into the Oculus Hands prefabs. There's righty. Give me a double click. Back on ghostly hands, back in the built-in renderer, and I'll pick a different one just so we can make a comparison. I think that was different. As always, test, don't trust. Does it meet your needs? Left hand is very hard to see, right hand's basically invisible. But you can have a fiddle with those values. I think that's a little bit more interesting. I quite like the outline on the right one, but obviously that's far too difficult to say. So fiddle with the values. You can make your own or you can customize your own. I'm just going to quickly see how that looks if I apply it again. So I'm going to have a play with the right hand, left hand. Is that the one I've got open? Yes, it is. I'm going to go with this one that's quite visible, and let's just change the settings and see what happens. I want this to be a little bit more pronounced. It's a little bit more pronounced. All I'm doing is just fiddling with the values and seeing what works. Better or worse. Interesting, and you can obviously change the colour if you wanted to. And left hand should now be kind of greeny yellow, is it? And a little bit more visible than it was, which it is. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't. It's an option, okay? So that's hand shaders. That just happens to be the one that I like and is free. Grabbing at set points, attach transforms. I've got a sword here. This sword currently isn't really a useful object. It is just a 3D object. It has no collider, it has no rigid body, and its point of origin is in the middle of nowhere. I want to make this object grabbable. As you'll remember from our earlier tutorials, to make something grabbable, you apply an XR grab interactable to it. If it doesn't have a rigid body, it will add a rigid body at this stage, which will give it physics. Common thing I'm seeing with students is we're pressing play. I don't even need to put the headset on to test this. And the object is just falling through the world and people are struggling to figure out why. If I double click on the sword, you'll see it's falling. The reason why the sword is falling is despite having the rigid body giving it physics, it doesn't have any colliders telling it to interact with objects, telling it to bounce off other solid objects. So you must always have colliders on an object. Now you can just slap a collider on that object. So just put a box collider and that's all over the place. I'm going to show you some better ways of doing this. I'm going to happen to click into the sword. This sword is broken into many subparts and I've deliberately given myself a difficult one to work with here. Maybe I've made it too hard for myself, but I want to show you how this works for anything. If you've got an object with a mesh renderer on it, that's actually drawing the 3D object. The first option you can do is apply a mesh collider. Now a mesh collider will do nothing unless you make it convex. Now this mesh collider looks for the mesh renderer and gets its details about where the collider's edges should be based on that. So you can see it finds the extreme points and makes a collider based around that. Problem that you've got here is, of course, that's imperfect, and it would, it's basically made like a little pyramid shape. diamond shape. I'll go with diamond. It's made a diamond shape, and that doesn't closely match the shape of this object. If I were to have something that was more rounded or something that didn't have these extreme protrusions, that's a nice, easy, lazy option, but too easy for us. So what I'm going to do with our sword is I'm actually going to make a child of it. So I'm going to right click on the sword, maybe even just on the parent, doesn't hurt, but I'm going to do it here. Right click, make an empty, and I'm going to call this empty object colliders. What I can then do with this empty object, which is going to do nothing, there's absolutely nothing special about this object, it's basically like a folder, is in the colliders, I'm going to right click and make a 3D object, which is a cube, and obviously that cube will be pretty big. And like I said earlier, I've deliberately picked an object that's complex because the colliders have inherited the rotation of this, and it was all over the place when the 3D modeler built it. I'm going to rotate this around until it's vaguely close. You see it's completely all over the shop, this object. For most of you, that will automatically just line up far better than I'm doing here. From what I can now do is grab the cube and I can stretch it and build a series of colliders that fit. Keep in mind at the minute I'm using global mode, so if I moved it left and right, it moves left and right in the world. I want to have it move forwards and backwards relative to its parent. So if I click global and turn it to local, now I can move it forward and backwards, and that's a little bit easier to line up on this complex shape. I'm going to create a box that's close. You know, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be better than our collider was a second ago. Notice how I'm just rotating the parent because I'm going to have all the children rotate the same axis. So that's better than it was, and you can eyeball this and you can spend as much time as you like getting this exactly right. I'm again going to be a little bit lazy just to show you the idea. That's close enough. I'm now going to duplicate that with Control and D and make another one which is thinner, because I want that to cover the very tip of the sword. I'm going to make a duplicate of this one, move it backwards, make it thinner, make it taller. Notice I'm just using the keyboard shortcuts here. I could be really accurate here and have two, so I could have one there and another one up there and another one up there, but for speed I'm just going to approximate the shape, and it depends on how much time and effort you're prepared to put into this. Notice as well that this is not exactly the right rotation, so I could make that a bit better. Depends on how much time you're prepared to put into it. And I'll do one final one that's going to represent the handle of the weapon. Perfect. That looks awful because I've now got a bunch of white rectangles where my pretty sword used to be. But if I click on all of the cubes, I can control click them to select all of them, or I can left click and then shift left click the bottom, which will select everything in the range. I can turn off the mesh renderer for all of them at the same time, gets rid of that horrible white shape, but keeps the colliders, and you'll see the colliders are now a much better approximation of the shape. So there's the sword, not falling off the table anymore. It is grabbable, but notice the grab point is absolutely wrong. That's why I picked this weapon. Nudge, 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 nudge. Because its point of origin is completely stupid. So you may have this problem where it's not grabbing in the correct location, which is where attach transforms come in useful, which leads me on to grabbing at set points, attach transforms. We want this sword to be grabbed here. We're actually going to make this a two-handed sword later on, but for now we're going to have this point here is where we grab it. So I'm going to right click on the sword, create an empty object just like we did before, and I'm going to call this grab point. I can now line up the grab point. Notice it's in the middle of nowhere, so I've got to go through a bit of effort to get it in the right place. Most objects are way easier than this. I deliberately picked a difficult one. Keeping in mind to get the rotation right, eyeball it. Notice I'm using the keyboard shortcuts like I said earlier, or you can use the buttons up here. rotate that around. And I'm using the gizmo, that shape, to help line up. Depends on how you want to hold the weapon. So here's a key thing. I'm using a sword here, and a sword, when you hold it, you kind of want it pointing up in the air, but a gun, you want it pointing forwards. The blue axis of this attach transform, or this grab point, will be the direction in which it points forwards. Now I don't want it holding like that, so what I can now do is rotate this 90 degrees, because I want that pointing forwards. I kind of want to hold it with that forwards. The greeny yellow one is the up axis, and the red axis is pointing to the right. So if I were to hold that, yeah, that feels about right. So what I can now do with the sword, wherever the grab interactable is, I can now put into the attach transform slot. Notice there's two of them, that will be important later. Our grab point. If I drag that in, that will now override the point that it gets grabbed. Despite the fact this object has a really stupid point of origin, it will ignore that and it will go to the grab point and use that. This may not be perfect. Depends how much time you want to put into it. But I'll go and grab the sword. I'll grab it somewhere stupid like up here, but notice how I'm grabbing it from that grab point we created. Maybe a bit easier in this hand. And then I can fiddle with the attach transform, so it's actually much more comfortable and much better and feels better. So we can fiddle with that to our heart's content and move it to wherever we think is appropriate. All I'm going to show you very, very quickly though, is if I move that up and perhaps move that backwards a little bit, it's going to be very difficult to line it up in such a way that the hands feel good while it's in our hand, because you've got to kind of position it exactly right, and maybe it's not worth your effort. Or if you're still going to use the controllers, it'll feel weird holding it with controllers in your hand. So if I go back to our interaction setup, if I go back to our controllers, it's worth pointing out there's a bunch of settings in the controllers, but the one I'm interested in is all of the 4 different types of interactor which are attached there. I've got poke, direct, ray and teleport. If I go to the direct interactor, that means if I grab it, physically grab it, we can do a bunch of stuff with that. Now is it in the controller or is it here? Oh no, it's in here. So the direct interactor, hide controller on select. So when I select something, should the hands or the controller or whatever is being drawn in disappear? Yeah, let's do that. That will obviously only affect the left hand. I want to do the same for the right hand here. Direct controller, hide controller on select. Just while we're doing this, I'm going to reset our left and right hand. So they've got that original material. I don't know, I'm just going to make them yellow for now. Pretend they're a Simpsons character. Just so it stands out for easy editing in a moment, so you can see it. So what should happen now is if I grab this directly, the hands should disappear. Remember, direct means physically grabbing it, so the hands are a little bit more visible. If I grab it directly, the hand disappears, and if I let go, the hand reappears. That may not feel great for you, and you may think, oh, that's not worth the effort, but trust me, it may be better than trying to line up the way the hand grabs an object. Notice if I grab it now with my left hand, that takes control. If I grab it with my right hand, that takes control. One thing I would test is how do your objects feel in both hands. The attach transforms, you may put it in the wrong way. I'm currently holding that at quite an extreme angle, so I could rotate the attach transform round a little bit so it's more comfortable in the hand. That's kind of the controls that you've got available to you. So, got some options. Notice though that if I grab it from distance, the hand does not disappear. And I've still got this blasted thing turned on by default. I think I turned that off in the example demo. If you really want that feature, why would you? So if you wanted that for both the ray interactor and the direct interactor, you've got to click on the ray interactors and do the same things. Hide controller on select, ray interactor, hide controller on select. And if you are fiddling with the ray interactors while you're here, oh, for goodness sake, turn on force grab and turn off anchor control. I literally cannot stand anchor control. That's the thing that makes things move from distance. I don't like it. Get rid of it. And now that will move to you as if you've got the force. So where are we? Grabbing its set points. Cool. Now you can have multiple set points if you want to. The advantages of that is if I were to go back to my sword and we've got our grab point, if I duplicated that and now had a second grab point that was down here, all that means is whichever one I'm closer to is the one I will hold it by. Oh no, I actually think what it will do is prioritise the one at the top of the list. So with my sword selected, I can now put the new grab point, and I've now got two of them. That one and that one, two different grab points. So we've got the grab points there. What this will not do is make it grabbable in two locations. Not yet. So if I grab the sword, it'll prioritise one grab point, and that's where I'm always grabbing it. You see, I'm always grabbing it at the top, no matter putting my hand here and grabbing it. I'm always grabbing it at the top of the handle. If we wanted to make this hand grabbable with two hands, I am just going to go and turn off hide controllers on select, and I'm going to do the same here, just because I want to show you what this looks like when the hand's grabbing it. If I go to my sword, and I now change the XR grab interactable to be select mode instead of single, set it to multiple, two-hand grab is now active, and you can hold it using two hands, which will control the rotation. Come on, controllers. There you are. So if I grab it, it will prioritise the top grab point. If I grab it at the bottom, now see that I can rotate it around in my hand. And whichever one is in the other hand is taking more ownership of it. But notice how the rotation works around one of the points. And maybe you like that behaviour, maybe you don't. Really good for spears or anything like that, or obviously two-handed rifles works really, really very well. You get the idea. So two-hand grab, exceptionally powerful. I think it's well worth considering for some items in your game, potentially. The problem is, we can currently grab the sword anywhere. And that to me seems a bit bonkers. If I reach out and grab it here, it feels strange that that would immediately teleport it in my hand. The player shouldn't be able to grab this sword by that point, I don't think. So if I walk over and I grab the sword from there, completely legitimate, that's what it does by default, grab, moves it to the handle. Okay, that's fine, I suppose, but maybe you want to make it so only this bit is grabbable. We can do that. So what you do with your item is you look at your colliders that you've made and you see which one is to do with the handle. Now you can see I've got this cube 3, which is the handle. I could rename it to handle grab or whatever, but for now, I want to make it so that's the only thing that's grabbable. Down here, I've got a thing called colliders, which is set to 0, because when the game loads, it will find all of the colliders and use those as grab points. If you want only one thing to be an acceptable collider, you open the list up, and it was cube 3 that I want to be acceptable. You'd think you'd put it in that bit, it says list is empty. You don't. You drag it into the word that says colliders. That will add it to the list, and that overrides the default behavior, meaning cube 3 is the only thing that can now be grabbed. Oh, I'll confuse my headset. So you'll notice I can't grab, whoops, by sword. If I just try that again, I shouldn't be able to grab the blade of the weapon, which I can't do, but I can grab the handle of the weapon, which is pretty nice. Oh. Just need to make sure I haven't broken something. Yep, that's fine. That's fine. One last trick while we're here is, at the moment, it doesn't really tell me if that's grabbable. Yes, I may get the vibration or get the haptic, but maybe I wanted that to glow or something. So we've got some options there. If we wanted it, we could make the Cube 3 currently has its mesh renderer off. We could just say, when I'm hovered, make it visible. Now, that's entirely an option. I think we have to do that through code. It'd be a bit of a faff. Now, I won't bother with that for tonight, but that's an option. The other thing I did just want to show you, though, is you saw where the sword fell through the floor. That is because the rigid body is using the most least intensive type of collision detection. It's called discrete collision detection. Continuous is better, continuous dynamic is betterer, and continuous speculative is the best. So for any object that's grabbable, I would always just say change its rigid body collision detection to be continuous speculative. That way it's almost impossible to throw it or have it fall through a surface. You can still push it through a surface and let go, but it means it shouldn't drop through a surface. So grabbing only at set points by changing the colliders. So there's a lot covered in here. Most of that will get you started for your project, but I just wanted to reiterate that on the Moodle page, I've got a bunch of resources that you may find useful. The key one obviously is Oculus Hands. Oculus.bat is sitting there as well if you needed that. Usually it's on the X drive, but if you wanted some characters, so avatar generator, you can generate some characters through that if you wanted to. Have a look at it. It's quite useful. Generate some 3D assets in addition to what's on the asset store. Mixamo, if you want, if you haven't gone through my animation tutorial all the way to the end, this shows you how you can plug in custom animations, custom motion capture. You just have to sign in with your college Google account and you can go and find some motion capture data. Let's wait for that to load. There's some dev assets resources. Ben Sound is really good for free background music. Free Sounds is, well, great for free sound effects. You just need to create an account with them. And if you want a sound effect of whatever it is that you want, it's got no shortage of choice. You get the idea. It's sound effects. You just need to create an account and download it. It's really, really easy. The shader we've talked about, royalty-free sound and music. I've actually forgotten where this takes us. Unlimited royalty-free audio. Probably useful having a look at that, depending on what it is that you want. As well as there's some demos here for the integrated tools, is that what I'm going to call it? You'll notice in the XRI examples folder and UI3D and in prefabs, you've got these things which I've talked about before. Dials, buttons, joysticks, levers, cool stuff. So that particular demo shows you how you can use this in quite a complicated scene. So if you did want to download that, it's a complete project. You would just open that if you wanted to have an explore of what it does. Most of those features I ripped out and already put into the project, but if you wanted a complete example of how it can be used, including doors and locks and stuff like that, that's in there as well. So that's hopefully a good start to get you guys thinking about the next couple of weeks of your development, because remember, in just a few weeks' time you're delivering your alpha demonstrations and then the beta after that. If I just go back to Mixamo, you have to sign in. Well, I think you can just log in with your Google account. Yeah, log in with Google, and it's a really powerful little tool. So go and have a play, get the core of your games operational, focus on the primary gameplay loop, and from there, good luck.